Ram Kaluahin enjoyed the way the wind blew through his thick black hair as he drove his small American convertible along the two-lane highway that would take him and his wife to the southernmost part of his home island, Kaatani. Located in the South Pacific Ocean, Kaatani actually consisted of several islands, the largest of which stretched approximately 100 kilometers from tip to tip and was home to approximately 1.5 million local residents and another 100,000 foreigners, mostly Americans. Kaatani was an independent state with its own government, police, and defense forces. Historically, the country was ruled by a monarch but has adopted a democratic system similar to that of the United States. It had a president who was elected for one 5-year term and a House of Representatives, whose members were elected by the citizens every 2 years. The nation began an aggressive modernization campaign more than 70 years ago under a previous monarch who felt it was time to usher the population into the 20th century. As a result, Kaatani today had all the conveniences of modern life, including the internet, along with all the trappings of modern civilization. Fortunately, the people managed to stay true to most of their ancient values, and as a result, the country still had the lowest divorce rate in the world, even higher than India, which has a divorce rate of just 1% according to some reports. Apart from the strange rocks scattered along the slopes of Mount Satani that glowed at night, sandy beaches, and the hospitality of the population, Kaatani had little to offer would-be conquerors, and had so far escaped the stigma of foreign rule. Even the Japanese did not consider Kaatani during World War II, believing it to be too far south to be useful for conquest of the Pacific. This was the place where Ram was born and raised, the place he called home, and he loved it. It's a good day for a walk, he thought. Not too hot, not too cold, and the humidity was tolerable at this altitude. However, the reason for the trip made him both angry and sad. He looked at the woman sitting in the passenger seat. Her name was Marion. She was a California beauty, he thought. Blonde hair, soft, supple skin, firm breasts, and tanned, toned legs, made for sex. She was not just his wife, she was every man's cherished dream. He had a little over an hour before they reached their destination, so he remembered their life together. He met her 6 years ago when he first took a teaching job at the local campus of an American university, headquartered in Washington, D.C. At that time, he had just defended his doctoral dissertation and decided to return home. The board of the local university welcomed him with open arms and offered him the position. He got used to it like a duck to water. He loved teaching and enjoyed teaching local youth. She worked as a consultant in the admissions office, and they met at a social reception hosted by the university president. They liked each other, dated for about a year, and eventually got married. She was an only child who had lost her parents in a car accident just a couple of years earlier. As far as he knew, she had no other relatives. Ironically, she wanted a traditional Kaatani marriage. He found this strange because most local girls these days wanted anything but a traditional marriage. At first, he thought that perhaps she was either patronizing him or a little delusional, and questioned her about it. Perhaps she didn't fully understand the true meaning of what she said she wanted, he thought. But she was adamant that this was what she wanted. So he gave her a text file with a chant to repeat at the ceremony and taught her how to pronounce the words correctly. She already knew a little of the local language, enough to communicate in the local markets, but not enough to fully understand the true meaning of what she was about to dedicate herself to. The ceremony itself was wonderful. Towards the end, Marion, in her short white robe, knelt down and picked up the pillow that lay next to her. She handed it to him and chanted the traditional phrase perfectly. An approximate translation of this phrase into English was, "I submit to you, my husband, in body, mind, and spirit." Of course, this phrase had a much fuller meaning, but it has long since been largely forgotten by all but the oldest and most traditional part of the population. He grabbed the sivaj lying on the pillow, a short curved dagger that in the old days husbands carried, a sign that they were forbidden and were ready to defend to the death what belonged to them, and only them. He admired Marion's work, an ornate pen bearing his family's seal. She even anointed him with her own blood, as was done in the old days. After he repeated the spell, he took a knife and cut the ties holding her robe in place, allowing it to fall to the ground. She remained motionless, and now her naked body was completely visible to those present. He opened his own robe and showed her his manhood. He then picked her up and laid her naked on the wedding altar. He spread her legs wide so everyone could see. He smiled as he looked at her. He moved closer and, in front of everyone present, got married on the altar. In ancient times, this was where the bride had to prove to her family and society at large that she was a virgin, worthy of her new husband. He helped her off the altar, and they walked down the hallway to his car. Now she belonged to him, and only him. After their first night on the island, they flew back to the States for a week-long honeymoon in Las Vegas. The next 3 years were wonderful. Ram and Marion continued their work at the university and spent their free time making tender love to each other. He could not imagine that life could become even a little better than it is now. Marion was then transferred to the main campus in Washington, D.C., so he too applied to transfer, hoping the school would give him a chance to teach at the U.S. Capitol. The board agreed to transfer him, and the two went to live and work in Washington. Marion lived there before coming to Kayatani and promised to show him all the sights, not knowing that he had spent several years in the city when he was in college. Over the next year and a half, a number of changes occurred in their lives. Marion's new position required her to sometimes work later than usual, travel, and attend social events where she rubbed shoulders with the rich and famous. Sometimes she took him with her to these events. Even though she had introduced him as her husband and professor, he had the feeling that he was a souvenir, or worse, an exhibit, a zoo creature for the locals to gawk at. More than once he felt awkward and irritated by the patronizing manner in which others spoke to him. Some even raised their voices and spoke slowly, as if he were some kind of disabled person who did not understand English. More than once he had to restrain himself from punching someone in the face. He remembered a conversation he had with Marion after a recent event. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked when he took off his expensive suit. "No, it's not like that," he growled in his deep baritone. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Did someone say something bad to you?" "Everything is as it was said," he told her. "Do you remember that scene in Outlaw Josie Wales where the character played by Chief Dan George talked about meeting Abraham Lincoln in the White House?" She nodded her head. "Yes, I remember," she said. "They just watched the movie on DVD a couple of evenings ago." "I can understand what he said," he told her. "It's almost as if these people think that because I'm a Pacific Islander, I should have a bone in my nose and wear a loincloth." "Well, you'd need a pretty long one," she told him, patting his crotch. He chuckled at this. "Don't they understand that I graduated from Harvard at the top of my class?" he asked her. "Don't they know how hard I worked to get through college so I wouldn't be a burden and not carry a heavy load of debt?" "I don't think so," she said quietly. "Well, I don't like these people you have to grovel to," he said. "And I'm damn sure I don't like being paraded around like some zoo specimen." "It's all part of the game," she said. "But I understand how you feel. You know you don't have to attend these events if you don't feel comfortable." He shook his head. "No, you are my wife, and I should be there to support you," he said. "Besides, I don't like the idea of someone else accompanying you. By the way, what's up with this new boss of yours, Jake Hamilton?" he asked. That evening, he met Jake for the first time and immediately disliked him. Hunter was written all over his face. "They just recently transferred him here," she said. "He's from New York. He's a really nice guy once you get to know him." "He seems to like you," Ram said. He couldn't help but notice that Jake spent most of the evening next to Marion. "Sometimes," he thought, "maybe just too close." "You're not jealous, are you?" she asked. He smiled and pulled her into his big hug. "Of course I'm jealous," he said playfully. "But he knows that you are married, right?" Yes, he knows, she said, hugging his neck. Okay, said Ram. I hope he remembers. They ended the night making love, but he had a bad feeling in his stomach. Something told him he needed to keep an eye on Jake Hamilton. Over the next 6 months, everything went wrong. Marion ended up being sent out of town with Jake several times and started working much later in the evenings, much more often than before. As a result, their sex life virtually disappeared as she always seemed too tired to do anything. It all came crashing down one day when Ram was in his office looking through student papers. He was interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," he said. The door opened and a petite brunette poked her head inside. She adjusted her glasses on her nose before speaking. "Dr. Kiluahin, do you have a couple of minutes?" she asked. He looked at her and immediately recognized her as one of the girls who worked in Marion's office, but he couldn't remember her name. He motioned for her to come inside. "Please come in," he said. "And feel free to call me Ram. My students call me Dr. Kaluahin, but you are obviously not one of my students." She entered his office and stopped in front of his desk. "What can I do for you, miss?" "Harper," she said quietly. "April." "Harper, I work in your wife's office." "Yes, of course," he said. "What can I do for you, Miss Harper?" "Well," she began nervously. "I don't quite know how to say this. I think it's best to just say what's on your mind," he told her. She nodded her head. "Well, it's about your wife and Mr. Hamilton," she said, completely capturing his attention. "I'm a little embarrassed to say this because it's quite personal, but I think what they're doing is just wrong, and I thought you had a right to know. That is, unless you already know and approve of it. I know some guys like that kind of stuff." "What is this thing, Miss Harper?" he asked. "What are they doing that upsets you so much?" "They are, well, having an affair," she said. He felt himself blushing. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Miss Harper?" he asked. "This is a serious accusation." "They go out for lunch almost every day," she said, "and their lunches often last longer than usual. They travel together all the time. He buys her flowers, and the way they interact makes it very clear that this is more than just a professional relationship. Plus, all the girls talk. Mr. Hamilton has a bad reputation, although he tries to keep it all a secret." "I understand," Ram said. "Have you personally witnessed anything that would suggest that they were having an affair? Have you seen them kissing each other or doing anything inappropriate? Anything?" "I actually saw them kissing once when they left his office," she said nervously. He nodded his head when she finished. "Tell me, Miss Harper, how often does Mr. Hamilton force you girls to work after hours?" he asked. She shook her head. "Usually we don't work after hours," she said. "The college is very strict about this. Marion and Jake sometimes stay out late, but the rest of us usually don't. The only time we can work after hours is when we are preparing for graduation or matriculation. But even then we have time to catch up. They hate paying overtime." "Understand. Did you say anything to anyone else?" he asked. "I didn't tell anyone anything," she said. "I wanted to convey this to you first. We all like Marion and don't want her to get in trouble. And yet, it is unsettling. If the dean or president ever saw this, they would pay big." "Yes, that would be so," said Ram. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Miss Harper. I'll take care of that next." "Thank you, Dr. Ram," she said. After she left the office, he opened the Word document he had saved on his computer. It was a list of private investigators and divorce lawyers that he had been collecting for some time. He had hoped that he wouldn't need to use any of the information, but he felt like he had no choice now. If she cheated like April said, he would have no choice but to divorce her. He took his phone and called. He wasn't surprised when Marion texted him later that day saying she'd be working late. He sat at the dinner table and picked at his plate, wondering what his wife and Jake were doing at that moment. Finally, he threw the rest of the lasagna down the garbage disposal and went upstairs to the master bedroom. He put on his pajamas and went to bed with the TV on. He woke up when he heard that Marion was in the room. She walked up to him, and kissed his forehead. Her hair smelled like it had just been shampooed, and he thought he smelled the scent of aftershave. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I didn't know he would keep me for so long." I had a snack on the way home. She went to the bathroom and soon came out in flannel pajamas. This was her signal that there would be no sex tonight. He really didn't want to have sex with her anyway, especially if she had just been with Jake. "He often keeps you late," Ram said. "How long will this continue?" "It's hard to say," she said. Because of him, the entire department worked late. He felt furious when he heard that she was lying to him, but he controlled himself. "The whole department, right?" he asked. "I thought the college didn't approve of overtime." "Usually, yes," she said. "But he has a big meeting coming up soon with several big sponsors, and we have to be ready for that." "Oh, that reminds me. We're going to New York on Friday. We leave before lunch and go away for the weekend." "That's pretty short notice," he said. Today was Wednesday, or rather early Thursday morning. "That's why we work so hard now," she said. "I'm sorry, I will make amends to you." "Okay," he said, turning over on his side. He knew it was bullshit, but he wanted to give her enough rope to hang herself. Later that day, Jake came to visit Ram in his office. He knocked on the door and entered before Ram could answer. Ram looked up and saw Jake's eternal grin. "What can I do for you, Mr. Hamilton?" he asked. "I just wanted to pop in and apologize for taking up your wife's time," he said. "I'm sure you may have heard the rumors, and I just wanted to reassure you that nothing untoward is going on." "I don't attach much importance to rumors, Mr. Hamilton," said Ram. "I deal with facts and evidence, and I certainly hope, for your own sake, that nothing inappropriate happens." Jake's grin faltered for a moment. This was not the answer he expected. In his experience, academic types tended to be weaklings. But there was something about this man that made Jake nervous. Maybe it was his voice or the inscrutable way Ram looked at him. There was nothing about Ram that suggested he was a weakling. And for a moment, Jake considered abandoning his plans for Marion. "Of course not, Dr. Kaluach-Hain," he said. "By the way, Marion told you that we will be in New York this weekend?" "She did it," Ram said. He deliberately didn't give Jake permission to call him by his first name because he really didn't like the man. "Quite a short notice, I must say. I was planning to take her out on Friday night. Lately, she has been spending more time with you than with me." "I apologize again for that," Jake said. "This is our job. It never ends, you know." "When do you think I can spend some time with my wife?" Ram asked with some sarcasm. "Very soon," Jake said. "We just have some things to take care of. Listen, I have to go now. It was nice talking to you." Ram said nothing, watching as Jake slipped out of the office. After Jake left, he picked up his phone and made another call. That afternoon, he received a text from his wife that she had to stay late at work again to prepare for a meeting that weekend. He wasn't surprised, and the email he received in his personal account didn't surprise him either. He headed home, stopping for dinner along the way. He'd had enough of lies and scraps. Around 8:00 p.m., he called Marion at her work number, but the call went to voicemail. He left a message and dialed Jake's work number. He received the same response, but did not leave a message. He read and reread the message he received earlier that day, and looked at the attached photos. He was still sitting at his computer when Marion returned late that evening. "Are not you asleep yet?" she asked with a concerned expression on her face. "Have you eaten anything?" "I stopped for dinner on the way home," he said. "I'm tired of leftovers." "I'm sorry," she said. "We were going to discuss everything one last time before the meeting." "So you were in your office?" he asked. "Well, yes," she said. "Where else should I be?" "Tell me that," he said. "I called your office at AITA, but did not receive an answer. I also called Jake at the office." "We were in the conference room and didn't hear the phone ring," she said. He knew the layout of her office and knew it was complete nonsense. Even if that was the case, she should have seen a message indicator indicating that someone was calling. "Didn't you see that I left a message?" he asked. "I didn't even look, Rami." "I'm really sorry," she said. "By the way, Jake said you were a little rude to him this morning." And what's all this talk about a date on a Friday night? You never said anything to me about this. It was supposed to be a surprise, he said. I guess it doesn't matter now. Of course it's important, Ram, she said. No, that's not true, he said. Now I need to go to bed, Marion. Good night. He trudged up the stairs to the master bedroom, wondering how long the deception would last before he put an end to it. He said nothing as she slid under the covers and tried to cuddle up to him. I love you, Ram, she whispered in his ear. He chuckled in response. I love you too, Marion, he said quietly, with a hint of sadness in his voice. Good night. She took the hint and rolled away from him. He heard quiet sobs from her side of the bed, but pushed them out of his mind. The next morning, he cornered her before leaving. Can you at least let me know where you're staying and keep in touch with me over the weekend? He asked. Of course, she said. She wrote down her hotel name and room number, then handed him the paper. Thank you, he said, folding the piece of paper and putting it in his pocket. Bon voyage. He turned to go out the door, but Marion intercepted him. Ram, what's the matter? She asked. You haven't been like yourself lately. Did I do something to make you angry at me? He almost laughed out loud. I think you know the answer to this question, he told her. Her face paled as he headed for the door without kissing her goodbye. I love you, Ram, she said as he got into his car. That's what you said, he replied before starting the car and driving to work.